Today's poll question on X at 1080 The Fan, we ask you, which matchup would you most like to see in the Big Ten title game? Oregon, Ohio State, Oregon, Indiana, Oregon, Penn State, or anyone but Oregon? Vote hard.
Oregon and Ohio State, the two best teams. I would take Oregon and Indiana because I'm all aboard the Hoosier train. The Michigan game gave me some pause. You know, that was the first time they played a real defense, and they gave Indiana problems. You know, we'll figure out what happens when they play Ohio State. But I think we knew coming into the season that Oregon and Ohio State were the two best teams. They played arguably the best game of the season. I don't think there's much argument to it. I think that was the best game of the season. Why wouldn't you want to redo that on a neutral field? And Ohio State seems to have some of their offensive line issues figured out. I mean, so I know some people will be like, oh, I don't need to see that game again. I will never understand that. If you give me an instant classic and it's decided by the slimmest of margins, literally 1 second, run that back, man. I don't need to see Penn State. I don't need to see Indiana. Give me Ohio State. Give me Oregon in Indy. Let's go.
Well, right now, Oregon, Indiana is leading the way here.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I think that's just because I feel like the Ducks fans think that they would beat Indiana.
Well, it's in theory, and I don't think it's much of a controversial theory. Indiana's an easier game. The talent level is way tilted in Oregon's favor.
Is it easier than Penn State? Because I don't know that it is.
I don't know if it is. I mean, again, I'm just such a believer in talent level. I mean, yes, coaching makes a huge difference, but we see this all the time in college football that when one squad has 4- and 5-star kids and the other squad has 2-star kids, you know, usually it ends up going one way. So, yes, if you're an Oregon fan and you had to take all the contenders in the Big Ten, I think the one that you would pick to play is Indiana. And Ohio State would be the scariest one, but I don't think Oregon fears anyone. I don't think Oregon fan necessarily wants to duck anyone. And maybe there's a sense of you just already beat Ohio State, so maybe you'd like to see something different. You know, and Indiana would be a fun story. It'd be a great story. Plus, if Indiana goes to the Big Ten title game, they're in the college football playoff. That means that they've beaten Ohio State and they're basically have assured themselves a spot. And I think it'd be cool to see Indiana and Boise State and BYU in there.
So if Indiana, Ohio State play next week, not this week.
I think there's a bye there for at least Indiana. I'll have to look. One of them has a bye, and then they play each other.
So whoever wins that game is likely going to the Big Ten title game.
Yes.
Right? Like that's technically a Big Ten title game elimination game.
You are correct, sir. In fact, I don't know if...
And then Penn State can't really... Like, there's nothing they can do because they need Indiana to win because Ohio State beat Penn State.
Yeah, I need to look and see what would...
Because if Ohio State beats Indiana, they would have beaten Indiana and Penn State. They're going.
Yeah, because Penn State and Indiana don't play each other. So I don't know what would happen if Indiana beats Ohio State and then loses another game to someone else. I don't know what would happen with that.
Well, it's the same thing as like if Oregon lost.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about Oregon,
you have to go into the tiebreakers.
Yeah, because if Ohio State beats Indiana, the thing about Oregon, they're undefeated. They're the number one team in the country. They've already beaten Ohio State, so you feel good about their chances of making the college football playoff. But should they stumble against Wisconsin or Washington, they don't play Indiana or Penn State.
Yeah.
If Ohio State then beats Indiana, Ohio State's in the Big Ten title game, and then how do you determine who is in between Oregon, Indiana, and Penn State, and what if they lose that tiebreaker?
You'd have to go back. So Indiana's on a bye. Ohio State plays Northwestern, then Indiana gets Ohio State, and then they finish with Purdue. So if they beat Ohio State, I mean, look, they're undefeated.
Well, Indiana, I think it's real easy if Indiana beats Ohio State.
Do you want the tiebreakers? I have.
Yeah, what's all the tiebreakers?
Number one, head-to-head. Then it'll be record against common opponent, followed by record against common opponents with the best conference record, proceeding through the common conference opponents based on their order of finish within the conference. So it's really going to come down to what you guys did against the same teams.
Yeah, and again, I'd have to go through and see. I still believe if Ohio State beats Indiana, it's Ohio State and Oregon. If Indiana beats Ohio State, more than likely, it's Indiana and Oregon.
Right, but what I'm saying is, what if Oregon loses?
Yeah, I don't know. Then it's
See, I
I
still
don't know
feel
how
like
that works.
I still feel like well,
I mean,
he just
we do know how it works. I
Yeah.
just don't know how everything.
Yeah,
lines up.
we don't know what the common opponents are right now and how both teams fared against
well,
them.
we
and-
do. We just
Well,
go
I'm
do
saying
the
we don't
homework.
have them offhand.
What's the matter with you? Do your homework.
Yeah,
What are you, a
working
sports
on
guy? What was I going to say to you here on Sports Talk?
I don't know. Couldn't tell you. You said if Oregon loses to, I mean, we were talking about if Oregon loses, what happens?
Oh, I was going to say that even if Oregon loses to Wisconsin
Mhm.
or Washington, not both, but one
Yeah.
of them,
Yeah.
if they stumble and they don't make the Big Ten title game,
they're in
they're still going to be in the tournament
100%.
because
Yeah.
they beat Ohio State and they have one loss.
Yeah. If you're an Oregon team and you have one loss, that's why I said if you're Penn State, you're
So Oregon's really good either way as long
Yeah.
as they
might
win.
be in with 2 losses. They might be able to lose their last 2 and be in the tournament of 12.
you need some help, but yeah, sure.
Yeah,
having having a win over Ohio State on your belt, like under your
Yeah,
belt.
The problem is that you'd have 2 bad losses.
Yeah.
And there's going to be because there's going to be a 2-loss SEC team that gets left out too.
Yep.
I think because of where you were ranked, you'd probably be okay.
And
But
they're
a-
not going
but
to
a-
lose both of these games.
No, but a 1-loss team, that's why I said like for Penn State is kind of funky. So Penn State cruising along and they lose to Ohio State. It's a close loss, kind of. They looked ugly, but they had a chance at the end, and they ended up losing 20-13. This is the rest of their schedule: Purdue, Minnesota, and Maryland. If Penn State beats Indiana and Oregon wins out, Penn State is just sitting there like, well, we don't even get to play for the Big Ten title. In all honesty, with the exception of that you wouldn't get the bye, dude, that's the best scenario for Penn State. Because unless you just find a way to lose to one of those 3 crappy teams, and Minnesota's not crappy, but they're not good, Penn State's in. And you don't, so it's a weird scenario now with this the 12-team playoff that sometimes if you want to guarantee a spot, you don't even have to play for your conference title.
Now that I'm thinking about this, if we get into those tiebreaker scenarios where it's between Oregon, Indiana, and Penn State to play Ohio State in the Big Ten title game, wouldn't Oregon go because they beat Ohio State when Ohio State would have beaten both Penn State and Indiana? Because those would be the only losses on everybody's record.
That would seem
Right?
to indicate, yes, I would think.
So they can.
I think that would be right.
So because they beat Ohio State, they're going to the Big Ten title game, even if they lose one of these next 2 games.
Yeah, they're fine. Like they're going to be okay.
You know what they should do? They should just rest their players.
Sit everybody. I'm telling you though, look through the, I know who was it, Heather Dennis. It was like, 3-loss teams going to get in. I'm telling you, look at the
No.
SEC. Look at the SEC standings. There's going to be a 2-loss SEC team.
Well, they have 7 teams right now with 1 or 2 losses.
Huh? Dude, Georgia.
Figuring out those tiebreakers is going to be a
7.
thing.
Dude, Georgia may be sitting there like, oh my God, like we could get left out. Yeah, I'm looking here. So, Texas A&M 7-2, Georgia 7-2, Ole Miss is 8-2, Alabama 7-2, Missouri 7-2, but they're out. They're done.
Well, here, I have one for you. I'll one-up you.
Yeah.
Because I saw this on the ESPN article today. If Georgia beats Tennessee, which they should, that'll be at home.
I don't know about that.
Dude, Georgia's going to beat Tennessee. If A&M beats Texas and all the other teams went out, you will finish with 7 2-loss teams in the SEC.
Yeah. And you're not getting more than probably 3.
7. Well,
So-
then you got to decide which 2 go
Yeah,
to
which
the
2 go.
championship. And then the loser of the championship game is done because they're going to have 3 losses, and then they'll fall behind a team that didn't go to the championship game because they lost the tiebreaker
Gonna
and they
get
only
funky.
have 2 losses.
Yep.
It's just wild.
So if you think there's going to be some 3-loss teams getting in there, I told you that last week. That ain't happening. And you just the SEC won't. It's just not. There's going to be too many 2-loss teams sitting there, and those spots are getting eaten up real quick. Conference titles.
Well, Ole Miss, Ole Miss is right back in the conversation now. They saved their season.
absolutely they have.
Alabama did too.
But you obviously have your 4 conference titles. Looks like Boise State probably is going to be in there, and then like a team. The loser of the Big Ten title game is almost guaranteed to be in at this point, and probably Penn State as well. So again, these spots just keep getting just gobbled up, and that Big 12 is interesting, although it kind of feels like maybe the Big 12 and the ACC are just cruising to 1 teams. Like if you want to get in, if you're in the ACC or the Big 12, I suggest you win. But if BYU somehow manages to nickel and dime their way to an undefeated season and loses the Big 12 title game, I'd be really hard to keep them out if they're undefeated and their only loss is the Big 12 championship. Because remember that, like TCU did that, and TCU got into a 4-team playoff, even though they lost the Big 12 title game and it was their only loss. If you go undefeated in the regular season, I don't think it matters what happens in your conference title game. I think you're in.